Whilst the Hasselblad XPan remains an incredibly long way out of my budget, last year I began to research some other ways in which I could start shooting some panoramic 35mm film images. Being a videographer and loving cinema and generally enjoying the cinematic look of a panoramic, wider 2:35:1 style aspect ratio, I knew that widescreen cinematic imagery was always going to be something that appealed to me. The XPan, of course, is the absolute king of this style of photography, as it retains the full quality and resolution of 35mm film just on a wider aspect ratio, but that quality comes at a cost of around £3,000 for the best deal that you can get right now. That includes a lens, at least. And whilst I'm only really shooting film imagery as a hobby and for this YouTube channel, well, multiple thousands of pounds on one camera would not be, for me, a particularly wise purchase. But when I saw this Minolta Riva Panorama on eBay at a fraction of the price, around £85, I thought that that was a price that I could stomach. And so my experience with panoramic 35mm images began. Let's talk about this little camera and discuss why I really ended up loving it despite its flaws. The Minolta Riva Panorama was first released in 1991 and actually goes by a few different names. The Riva Panorama here in Europe, the Minolta PNS in Japan, and the Freedom Vista over in the US. From a brief technical perspective, it crops a 35mm frame to a roughly 3:1 aspect ratio. It features a 24mm f4.5 lens, shutter speeds ranging from 1/4 of a second to 1/200th of a second, automatic film loading, advancing and rewinding, a built-in flash which can be toggled on or off with a button on the top of the camera, and DX decoding of the film speed that you are using. This is, however, limited to ISO 100 when using a film below a speed of ISO 400, and it defaults to ISO 400 when using a film of ISO 400 or above. This does mean that unless using a specific 100 or 400 ISO film, you will be slightly overexposing your images, and with negative film this often actually works to your advantage. I had this with both of the rolls of film that I shot, as I shot respooled Kodak 250D and a roll of Kodak 200, which means that the Riva was exposing for an ISO 100 film and giving me about a stop of overexposure on both of the rolls that I shot. This camera works by intentionally blocking part of the top and bottom of the frame so that it gives off that panoramic wider aspect ratio. While some other 35mm film cameras have this as a mode that can be toggled with a button, the Riva Panorama actually forces you to shoot in this aspect ratio, so you have no other choice. All of the images that you take will be in a roughly 3:1 widescreen aspect ratio. So let's talk about those images now. The first roll that I shot was the respooled Kodak 250D, and I shot these images in a variety of locations. Some of these first images were just shot whilst walking around London. I shot some whilst down at the coast and also on a couple of photo trips in the New Forest. And then I just finished up the roll, sort of shooting a few miscellaneous photos, just going about my daily life. From an image quality perspective, I was actually pleasantly surprised at the results that I got back from the Riva Panorama. The lens itself is surprisingly sharp, particularly in the center of the images. It resolves quite a good amount of detail. When you get to the corners of the images, it does tend to fall off pretty drastically, and it does get pretty soft, and actually also has some pretty heavy vignetting and a little bit of distortion. Arguably, this potentially plays into the slightly cinematic look, and for me, it was just about subtle enough to be passable. From my experience, the metering was fairly effective and gave me a good exposure on the majority of the images that I shot. Obviously, overexposing the film because of the DX coding helped with that. This version of the camera actually has no exposure compensation controls, and so I was completely in the hands of the camera in regard to what sort of exposure I was getting on each image. In fact, there is a very little number of controls on the camera in general. The camera turns on with a little sliding toggle below the lens, which also slides a cover across the front of the lens when it's turned off. I will say this is a pretty handy feature to ensure that you're not going to take any images when you're transporting the camera, maybe in your pocket or in a bag. The Riva Panorama has a little self-timer toggle on the top of the camera, which I didn't actually play around with whilst I was shooting, and then on the top left of the body it has a flash cancel button, which if you hold down before pressing the shutter button, it'll stop the flash from firing. I'll be honest, I couldn't really see a clear indicator of when the flash was going to fire, and so I didn't really end up using this. I just let the camera decide when the flash was needed or not needed, and as I was shooting most of these photos in exterior daylight conditions, I didn't notice the flash firing all that often. It may even have fired for all of the shots, but out in bright daylight, I couldn't notice. And if it did on the daylight images, it had no effect. The viewfinder on the camera is actually one of my favourite parts, as it is already in that wide aspect ratio, and it has some bright frame lines showing exactly what is going to be in the frame. Composing images was probably one of the biggest positives for me about the camera. I felt like it really encouraged me to think in that widescreen cinematic aspect ratio when looking for images, and it certainly helped to see what the final exposed image was going to look like. For the second roll, as I said, I shot Kodak Gold 200 through the Riva Panorama, and again I took these images in a mix of locations. The first half was shot just on a walk around a local lake area, and the second half was shot at a monument that I actually went to recently for a video testing the Pentax Spot Meter 5. I'll leave a link to that video down in the description and a card up there as well if you are interested, but here's some of my favourite images from that second roll. From a usability standpoint, I actually really enjoyed the simplicity of shooting with the Riva Panorama. It's a point and shoot in its most simple form, and as I said, it really encouraged me to get into that wide aspect frame of mind when looking for images. It's obviously a very small camera, and so carrying it around is super easy. It will fit in any pocket you want, and I often found myself going out for shoots focusing on other things but bringing this with me because it was just so easy to slip into my pocket and take with me wherever I was going. I did also get this sleek little carry case with mine in case I wanted to pop it in a bag to travel with, though I do think that this thing is well built and sturdy enough that you could probably just do without this case if you wanted. A couple downsides that I will just note about the Riva Panorama and that I experienced when I was shooting: it obviously is just blocking the top and bottom portion of a 35mm film frame from being exposed, and so it's not a true panoramic camera. You do lose some resolution compared to the premium cameras like a Hasselblad XPan or a TX-1, and so of course that does contribute to the lower quality images that you will get out of using it. Using my home scanning setup, I was getting around a 6,000 pixel width by 2,100 pixel height image. It's certainly not a tiny image like a half-frame 35mm camera, and there is a lot of quality there, but just know that you obviously do get a slightly inferior quality compared to those more premium, more expensive panoramic 35mm cameras that use the entire height of the film. I also do tend to struggle just a little bit with smaller cameras like this one, in that somehow I managed to get my finger occasionally into the lower right corner of the image. I'm sure that is user error and it's something that you'd get used to, but if you do have larger hands, just be aware that it is something that you're probably going to have to be conscious of, at least in those first few rolls that you shoot. And then something that I'm sure is specific to my camera is that it doesn't seem to auto rewind every roll. After shooting that first roll, it didn't let me take any more images, and so I assumed that it had auto rewound, but I actually opened the back and the film was still there, and so that did contribute to some light leaks on the images throughout that first roll. It does have a manual rewind button, and so once I closed the back up and pressed that, I had no more issues, but obviously that certainly wasn't ideal. The roll of Kodak Gold that I shot, that was the second roll, however, it rewound perfectly fine, and I had no issues at all with that, so possibly just a one-off, possibly something faulty, probably just specific to my model. Overall though, I really enjoyed my experience shooting with the Minolta Riva Panorama. I think that some of the images that I got, I am actually really happy with, whether that's purely down to the nature of the 3:1 widescreen aspect ratio, or if this thing actually is really capable of producing some good images. I'm not 100% sure, I think they probably a little bit of both, but I'll let you decide on that. As a tool though, it allowed me to think in a more cinematic mode and almost focus on what I would create video imagery of, but instead of putting that onto a video, it put it onto a 35mm film negative. And for me, because of that, this camera was great. Yes, it has a couple of quirks, and it is a very simplistic camera when it comes to exposure tools and the creative input that you can give to your images. It's certainly not perfect, but when comparing to the cost of the premium XPans and TXs of the panoramic world, I'm very happy that I made this purchase, and I think that if you're looking for a cheap way to get into panoramic film photography, this really is not a bad option at all. That is going to be all for this one though, so if you did enjoy, please do leave me a like, let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below if you've used this camera, or perhaps you've used another panoramic film camera, particularly if there's one that's even cheaper or similar budget to this, then I would love to hear about your experiences down in the comments below. And finally, please do consider subscribing if you want to see any more of my content going forwards. Stay safe everyone, stay happy, and I'll see you in the next one.